Hello YouTube! In this video we're going to talk about skepticism of the external world. In particular, the attempt to show that we can refute external world skepticism by appealing to inference to the best explanation. Let's begin with external world skepticism. If you've done any philosophy at all, I imagine you will have encountered this view. So there's a common sense picture of things, which we will call the common sense hypothesis, which says something like this. There is an external world, and our senses provide a reasonably accurate picture of at least some parts of it. We have, sensory organs. The sensory organs deliver information about material objects, and most of our common sense beliefs about the world that are formed on the basis of this sensory data are true. External world skepticism challenges this. So, opposed to the common sense hypothesis, we can come up with various skeptical hypotheses. For example, the argument goes, for all you know, you might be a brain in a vat. When you have the visual impression of a tree, what causes this is not light reflecting off the tree and entering your eyes, but a very sophisticated machine that is stimulating just the right parts of your brain to produce that visual impression. With this hypothesis in mind, we can cast doubt on any proposition about the external world. So propositions such as, I have hands. So the argument would go, if I don't know I'm not a brain in a vat, I don't know I have hands. I don't know I'm not a brain in a vat, so I don't know I have hands. And of course this argument will generalise to all other claims about external objects. The result is, according to the skeptic, there's no justification for believing that there is an external world. And, the basic issue here is one of underdetermination, right? Our experiences, our sensory data, are logically compatible with a host of hypotheses other than the common sense hypothesis. Our experiences would be indistinguishable if the brain in a vat hypothesis were true instead. There's no evidence, there's no experience that can distinguish between the common sense hypothesis and the brain in a vat hypothesis. And if there's no evidence that can decide between two hypotheses, then it seems that you should not believe either one. In general, for some evidence to justify belief in a proposition, that evidence must rule out alternatives to that proposition. At the very least, it must in some way tell against alternatives to that proposition. Perhaps it need not outright refute them, but it must support the proposition more strongly than it supports the alternatives. But the skeptic will say that our experiences provide no basis whatsoever for favouring the common sense hypothesis over various skeptical hypotheses, such as the brain in a vat hypothesis. So that's the general skeptical argument. There are, of course, many responses to this argument, and maybe I'll do further videos on other responses in the future. In this video, though, I want to focus specifically on the attempt to refute skepticism by appeal to inference to the best explanation. This is the explanationist response. According to explanationism, we can break the tie between the common sense hypothesis and skeptical hypotheses such as the brain in a vat hypothesis, because the common sense hypothesis provides the best explanation of our sensory data, and in general we are justified in believing that our best explanations are true. On this view, contrary to premise 2 of the skeptical argument, I do know that I'm not a brain in a vat, and this is because the brain in a vat hypothesis is a poor explanation. Our experiences, therefore, do tell against such skeptical hypotheses and in favour of the common sense hypothesis. So we use inference to the best explanation all the time. Suppose that one day I hear scratching in the wall, the pattering of little feet at night. I find bite marks on wiring. I find small droppings scattered on the floor. I find damage to food packaging. I will infer from this that a mouse has entered my home. That is an explanation, that is a hypothesis that accounts for that data, and that seems like the best explanation. There are other explanations available. Perhaps these disturbances are caused not by a mouse, but by ghosts. Or perhaps they're caused by a group of pranksters trying to convince me that there's a mouse in the house. But these hypotheses are far less plausible explanations. The ghost hypothesis requires inflating our ontology. It requires postulating entities that I have no other particular reason to believe in and that are hard to square with my background understanding of the world. And it's also not clear why or how a ghost would behave in this kind of way. Like, why would a ghost chew on wires or leave droppings? The prankster hypothesis, I suppose, is a bit more plausible, but, it's still pretty strained. I mean, we know that humans generally don't trespass on other people's property just to cause mild irritation to the owners. That would be truly bizarre behaviour. By contrast, we have very good reasons to think that there are mice, to think that mice sometimes get into people's homes, and we can understand why mice would chew on wires and leave droppings and so on. So this is a very simple example, but this is a case where we are using inference to the best explanation, or so it seems, to draw a conclusion about the world. And we use inference to the best explanation in more sophisticated theorizing as well, at least arguably. So why do scientists accept general relativity? Well, because general relativity provides the best explanation for phenomena such as the value of light bending around the sun, the precession of Mercury's perihelion, the gravitational redshift of light, and so on. So how do we determine what counts as the best explanation? Well, we judge potential explanations against various explanatory criteria. So when we face some puzzling phenomena, we propose various hypotheses to account for that phenomena, and then we judge those hypotheses against explanatory criteria. Unsurprisingly, there's a lot of debate among philosophers about what exactly the criteria of explanatory goodness are, but here's a list of some things that might be criteria. So accommodation of the relevant phenomena, this is an obvious one. This is just to say that the explanation should in fact succeed in accounting for the facts we're trying to explain, right? So like when I say that there's a mouse in the house, that does in fact account for the phenomena in question. Whereas I suppose if I was to say something like, well, there's a bunch of ants in the house, that actually just wouldn't account for the phenomena. That wouldn't account for like the droppings, for instance, because ants don't leave droppings. Then there's consistency. Obviously, the explanation has to be logically consistent. There's simplicity, or Occam's razor: do not multiply entities beyond necessity. This is one problem with the ghost explanation. It requires us to add very bizarre entities to our ontology when well-established entities, namely mice, would do just as well. Predictive power and falsifiability, so the explanation should support accurate predictions about the future. With the mouse hypothesis, because we know how mice tend to behave, we know what other signs to look for. For instance, the ammonia smell of mouse urine. If we suppose that there's a ghost in the house, on the other hand, well, it's not clear that we can draw any predictions from that because we have no idea how ghosts behave. Another is explanatory depth, so we want our explanation to leave the fewest unanswered questions, right? Good explanations in general do not raise more questions than they answer. Again, the ghost hypothesis is a poor explanation because it's not clear why ghosts would cause the phenomena we're trying to explain. Right, so that's not an exhaustive list, and of course some of these entries may be disputed, but this should make it reasonably clear how inference to the best explanation is supposed to work. And it's easy enough to see how this might apply to the skeptical arguments. Our sensory experiences exhibit various features, various patterns, and we can propose hypotheses to account for these features. And then we should infer to whatever hypothesis best explains these features, to whatever hypothesis scores the best on the criteria of explanatory goodness. So what are the features of experience that are thought to require the common sense hypothesis? Well, first of all, an important feature of experience is that our sensory impressions are involuntary and spontaneous. So as soon as I open my eyes, I just see various objects around my room, and I don't have any control over that. Like, I can't will my perceptual impressions to be different in the way that I can, will what I imagine or like what I think, for instance. Like once I open my eyes, I'm just going to see a computer and a cup, and that they just impose themselves upon me. Moreover, perception exhibits a kind of continuity over time. So I might see a car driving to the left, and then it's occluded by a building, and then I see it emerge from behind the left of the building at a time corresponding to the speed it was travelling. So there's a sort of continuity there. Or if I'm looking at the objects around my room and then I shut my eyes and open them again, I have the same impressions as I did before. The computer, the table, the four walls, all still there as they were before. Finally, perception exhibits coherence across different sensory modalities. So when I'm examining a knife, there's the visual impression of the blade's sharp edge, and there's the tactile sensation of the sharpness of the edge, and the tactile sensation of the weight of the object. And there's auditory sensations that are produced when I use the knife to cut material. There's the pressure I have to apply to make the knife cut, and so on. So all of these impressions across different sensory modalities all have a kind of coherence to them. And of course, this is just one small aspect of the perceptual field. So over time and across all of our different sensory modalities, perception presents a rich, complex tapestry of coherent impressions. And the common sense hypothesis gives us a very straightforward explanation for all of this. The explanation is that these sensory impressions are, generally speaking, accurate representations of an external world. The reason why I have visual, tactile, auditory impressions that all seem to represent a single object, where these impressions persist over time in a coherent way, so like I can return to my kitchen over years and have similar impressions over time of this same object. The reason for all of this is there really is a knife in my kitchen. And what's particularly powerful about the common sense hypothesis is that not only can we posit external objects that are causes of our experience, we can also explain how these objects behave the way they do. When I have the impression of the knife cutting the carrot, and then the carrot is split in half, I can understand this in terms of the material properties of the knife and the material properties of the carrot. There's a reason why I use the knife to cut the carrot, but I couldn't use a spoon to do so. And I can understand that in terms of the material properties of those objects. And that's something that you might think is missing in skeptical hypotheses. Because, if I'm a brain in a vat, for instance, well, why is the vat producing a kind of coherent set of experiences for me? Why does the correlation between particular sets of impressions hold, such as hard, sharp objects being required to cut carrots? A brain in a vat, after all, you could generate the impression of spoons cutting carrots. So you might think that there's not really an account being given here. All that we can say on a skeptical hypothesis is that your appearances are deceptive. And that's about it. So it doesn't sort of give this nice account of correlations that can appeal to material properties of different objects. Moreover, notice that the common sense hypothesis is falsifiable in a way that skeptical hypotheses are not, because I could come to believe that what I thought were experiences of an external world were actually deceptive. I could have certain experiences that would lead me to believe that, I've been living in the Matrix, say. But it seems like no experiences could show that I'm not in the Matrix. So skeptical hypotheses may well accommodate our experiences in a consistent way, but in terms of other criteria such as simplicity, predictive power, fewest unanswered questions, whatever, they perform poorly. So the assumption here, of course, is that explanatoriness is something that tracks truth, right? And we'll just grant this for the sake of argument. So we'll grant that inference to the best explanation does indeed justify belief. Now, I should note that this is extremely controversial. Indeed, actually, I don't accept inference to the best explanation, and there are plenty of other philosophers who are also skeptical of inference to the best explanation, but we will put that aside here. So our question is whether the common sense hypothesis is in fact the best explanation, and we'll look at 4 challenges to this. So first of all, a point which has been raised by Susanna Renard in her article, External World Skepticism and Inference to the Best Explanation. We've seen that the explanationist proceeds by citing data about certain patterns in our experience. But from the point of view of the external world skeptic, it's hard to see what justification there is for supposing that experiences do in fact have these features, that experiences have the features that are thought to be best explained by the common sense hypothesis. The arguments for skepticism about the external world straightforwardly generalise to skepticism of memory. But if you're a skeptic about memory, then you're not going to have any justification for supposing that there has been continuity and coherence in your experience over time. So, I mean, the common sense hypothesis includes claims about past experience. It includes the claim that memories are generally reliable, that the external world existed long before we were born, and so on. And we can easily construct skeptical hypotheses against these. So consider a brain in a vat, identical to your brain, that was brought into existence just 10 seconds ago. This person would have the same apparent memories as you, but they would be false memories. Their present mental state is by stipulation completely indistinguishable from yours. So the observations that you make do not distinguish between the lifetime brain in a vat and the 1 minute brain in a vat, or the 10-second brain in a vat. And more generally, it's a common enough point that just as our senses can deceive us, so memories often deceive us. Even if you're not a skeptic, there's plenty of psychological research showing that memory is fallible. So the common sense hypothesis is claimed to be the best explanation for features of our experience. That's only going to be a convincing argument for the common sense hypothesis if we are convinced that those features do in fact obtain. But the external world skeptic probably won't accept this. She is going to say that we don't have good reason for supposing that experiences exhibit this continuity and coherence over time, because just as we should be skeptical of our senses, we should be equally skeptical of memory. So what might we say in response to this? Well, we might think that there are still going to be resources available to the explanationist. First of all, the explanationist might appeal to the complexity, coherence and stability of my present sensory impressions. Now, perhaps this isn't as impressive as, long-term coherence over time, but, it still calls for explanation, right? Like, there's still some sense in which my present experiences still do exhibit, a great deal of complexity, and they still exhibit coherence. And that calls for explanation. Second, there's the fact that I seem to remember having sensory impressions that were coherent over time. Regardless of whether or not I actually did have such impressions, it seems to me that I did. And this seeming calls for explanation. The common sense hypothesis provides a straightforward explanation of both of these facts, and the explanationist will say it remains a superior explanation to any skeptical hypothesis. So, I mean, if we think that, if we think that the common sense hypothesis provides a good explanation of the continuity and coherence of perceptual impressions over time, right? It does seem pretty plausible that we would want to say that, it also provides an explanation for these things, for the coherence of present sensory impressions and for the fact that I seem to remember having coherent impressions over time. So, the data on which we are basing the common sense hypothesis has been reduced pretty significantly, but there is still data to be explained. And so the explanationist may say that we have the best explanation for these facts for this smaller set of data, and it remains superior to any skeptical hypothesis. So maybe the explanationist has a plausible response to this point. Okay, let's turn to a second problem. Putting aside concerns about knowledge of the past, and let's just grant that experience over time has the features it seems to. Well, the second problem is that there are, the skeptic may argue, various cases where experience exhibits similar features, but where we are not inclined to take these experiences to be veridical, to accurately correspond to an external world. Consider dreaming. Dreams can exhibit a remarkable degree of continuity and coherence, in much the same way as perceptual experience does. Of course, sometimes dreams are very unstructured and chaotic, but often enough we have dreams that are very much like waking life, where we do mundane things and we interact with seemingly normal objects. When I handle a knife in a dream, I may have both the visual and tactile sensations of sharpness, and it may operate just like a normal knife cutting through vegetables, say. But of course, we don't postulate external objects to account for these features of the experiences of dreams. And indeed, we think this would be a very bad explanation in the case of dreams, right? Like to suppose that dreams involve like literally accessing some alternative reality where there are external objects and so on, right? That seems like a really bizarre explanation, I think most people would say. Along similar lines, we can point to illusions and hallucinations. These rarely consist of just completely random impressions. So I've never taken any powerful hallucinogenic drugs myself, but if you read the accounts of people who have taken LSD, magic mushrooms, DMT, and so on, these drugs produce characteristic kinds of experiences which are sometimes quite remarkably complex and which clearly exhibit a kind of internal coherence. So here are just a few reports of DMT experiences from Strassman's book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule. These are various different participants who took DMT. So one person says, the visuals were dropping back into tubes like protozoa, like the inside of a cell, seeing the DNA twirling and spiraling. They looked gelatin-like, like tubes inside which were cellular activities. Another person reports, there was a spiral DNA type thing made out of incredibly bright cubes. I felt the boxes at the same time that my consciousness was lifted. Another report, there was a woman speaking Spanish all the time throughout the trip. She had quite a unique accent. Maybe it wasn't Spanish, but it sounded like it. At one point she said, regular. She threw a white blanket over the scene and then pulled it back repeatedly. Fourth and final one, I was above a strange landscape, like Earth but very unearthly, mountains of some sort. It was very friendly and inviting. I was hovering miles above it. I had the very distinct sense of doing this, not just the visual perception. So, these cases have plenty of other descriptions like that, and what we find then is that when what people experience when they take these drugs appears to them as organised phenomena. There are specific kinds of objects, patterns, and entities involving all the sensory modalities. I mean, like you both see and hear and feel them, say. Now, obviously, the experiences that you have during dreams or when taking hallucinogenic drugs, these do not have exactly the same features as normal perceptual experience, but they do exhibit continuity, coherence, stability. Certainly, it seems like the differences between like normal waking experience and the dreams and drug experience, if there's a difference with respect to continuity and coherence, it seems like only a difference in degree rather than a difference in kind. Again, this is a case where it seems much less plausible to appeal to something like the common sense hypothesis to account for these features of experience. The skeptic might also draw an analogy to computer games. Computer games exhibit striking regularities, similar to the kind of regularities we find in waking experience, but the regularities in this case do not correspond to external objects that, in any sense, mirror what is being displayed on the screen. When a tree is displayed on the screen, this is produced by processes going on in the computer, but somebody who had access only to the images on the screen would not be able to infer anything about what those underlying processes are like. The kind of virtual world that is presented on the screen is radically different from the underlying program that produces it. So, the explanationist says that we can believe the common sense hypothesis because it's the best explanation of certain features of our experience. But the skeptic will object that there are a variety of cases where experiences or objects exhibit similar features, but where we do not infer to anything analogous to the common sense hypothesis. In these cases, even the anti-skeptic will favour some alternative account, right? When it comes to dreams, when it comes to hallucinations, the anti-skeptic favours an alternative account. And these cases aren't particularly outlandish. I mean, everybody dreams, and plenty of people have taken drugs, all of which have regular, repeatable types of effects. So, What this suggests is that the common sense hypothesis is not required to account for features of normal waking experience either. Whatever mechanisms account for the continuity, stability and coherence of the experiences in dreams or drugs might also underlie our normal sensory experiences. The key point is that we know that there are... maybe I shouldn't say the word "no" in a video that's on skepticism, but let's just go with it. So the key point is we all accept, let's say, that there are other mechanisms to account for these features beyond the mechanisms postulated by the common sense hypothesis, right? So even the anti-skeptic accepts that there are other mechanisms to account for features like continuity and coherence beyond the mechanisms postulated by the common sense hypothesis. And in this respect, then, it may be argued that the common sense hypothesis fails the simplicity criterion. It multiplies entities beyond necessity. So we need other mechanisms to explain dreams and drug trips anyway, regardless of whether we accept the common sense hypothesis. But then why not just say that those same mechanisms are operative in normal waking experience? The common sense hypothesis is unparsimonious. It unnecessarily inflates our ontological commitments. In that respect, is actually a bad explanation. Or so the argument might go. In any case, right? Once we grant that there are cases of experiences that exhibit continuity and coherence without, mirroring an external world, objects in the external world, that does seem to undermine the appeal to the common sense hypothesis as being the best explanation. Right, a third problem is that it's not clear that the common sense hypothesis actually offers an explanation anyway. So again, this point is made by Susanna Renard. So the explanationist idea is that we have this pattern of continuities and coherence in experience, and to explain this, the common sense hypothesis postulates a realm of mind-independent physical objects that, in a sense, mirror these continuities and regularities. When I see my computer and I blink and then I see my computer is still there, what explains this continuity is a continuity in the realm of physical objects, namely the continued existence of a particular physical object, the continued existence of my computer that is causing my visual impressions. Continuities in experience correspond to continuities in the realm of physical objects. But as Renard points out, how does this explain continuity? Doesn't this just push the problem one step back? Like the data in need of explanation is that our experience exhibits continuity, but then to explain this, we've postulated continuity in physical objects, which surely would call out for explanation just as much. After all, if the continuity in the behaviour of physical objects does not require explanation, it's not clear why continuities in experience would require explanation. What needs to be explained is exactly the same thing. It's patterns of continuities. Now, of course, it will not do at this point to postulate some third realm containing other types of objects with regularities to which the continuities in physical objects correspond. That would set us off in an infinite regress. Rather, what the kind of move that is usually made here is to say that what explains continuities in the behaviour of physical objects are laws governing those objects. So if we think so why does my computer continue to exist over time? Well, because it's composed of atoms, and because those atoms behave according to particular physical laws, and once you spell out what those laws are, it entails that you're going to have the computer continuing to exist. At least, given the right environmental conditions and so on. But the point is that what's really doing the explanatory work here is the laws. But now, Renard asks, why do we need to postulate the physical realm at all? Why not simply say that there are laws governing experience, which would then explain the continuities in experience, without taking this detour through physical objects? So what's really doing the work of explaining continuity is this idea of laws. But then you can just say that there are laws governing experience. And now we have a simpler explanation, that, Renard says, does the same explanatory work. It's simpler in that it requires fewer kinds of objects. So, on this, I guess, phenomenalist or idealist type explanation, there would be no physical objects, there are just experiences and laws governing experiences. In that respect, we have greater ontological simplicity. Moreover, the common sense hypothesis requires laws not just governing physical objects, but laws governing how physical objects interface with experience. So how it is that our experience either arises from or interacts with, or whatever, the physical world. Merely to say that there is a particular physical object in front of me, a computer, does not explain why I have the experiences I do. We'd also need to account for the interface of this object and my experience. And the kind of phenomenalist explanation that just appeals to laws of experience doesn't require any of this, right? It only requires laws governing experience itself. Renard does note what I suppose is perhaps an obvious objection to this, which is, well, what exactly would these laws of experience be? Nobody has articulated them. On the other hand, we have articulated many of the mechanistic laws governing the behaviour of physical objects, which can then be used to account for the continuities in physical objects, and in that way the continuities in experience. We simply don't have a kind of purely experiential science, a science that is stated purely in terms of experience. Now, Renard's response to this is to say that the lack of laws of experience could simply be the result of the fact that far more effort has been put into articulating laws in terms of physical objects. Scientists have generally proceeded on the assumption of the common sense hypothesis, so that's just the way that scientific theories are framed, right? Scientific theories are framed in terms of that assumption. But Renard says we just don't have any reason to assume that it would be more difficult in principle to have constructed a system of laws of experience. So I'm not sure about that, but I think perhaps there's a deeper response available here, which is, well, it seems that any set of laws that could plausibly be said to hold of physical objects must be transformable in some sense into laws of experience. And the reason is that the justification for the specific content of laws governing physical objects ultimately rests on experience, right? Scientific theories are tested against what we observe. Our belief in, so if we postulate certain laws of orbital motion, well, ultimately, that has to rest on regularities in experience. That has to rest on patterns in the observations we make with our sensors, or at least with sensors aided by instruments. For any scientific theory, we can construct an experiential counterpart to it, which would assert that only the experiential consequences of that theory are true. This experiential counterpart would still specify law-like regularities. They would just be regularities in experience. You would still, you'd still have laws, or at least law-like regularities, but without supposing that there are physical objects. Now, of course, we might object to this that it's not enough for a theory to specify law-like regularities. If the theory is to provide an explanation for the behaviour of objects, we need laws in a stronger sense. We need laws that govern objects in the sense, or that govern experience in the sense of specifying necessary connections. For example, we might think it's a true proposition that no object exceeds the speed of light. But the argument would be that the law of nature here is not simply that nothing exceeds the speed of light. Rather, the law of nature is the underlying principle that necessitates that nothing exceeds the speed of light. Acceleration beyond the speed of light is forbidden from occurring. Now, I won't get into this debate here, but if you're interested in this, you should check out my video on laws of nature for more. One point I would make is that it's not obvious that this notion of laws, so the notion of laws as involving physical necessity, is actually part of the content of any scientific theory, as opposed to being a sort of philosophical gloss on certain scientific theories. Again, this gets us into a big debate about the nature of laws and so on. it would be a bit of a tangent to get into that here, but yeah, I would just flag that up. But maybe this is one way we might resist the skeptic, is to say that, well, we don't have like any set of experiential laws, and yes, we can construct kind of experiential counterparts to our theories, and those experiential counterparts would describe law-like regularities, right? But they don't actually describe laws as underlying principles that necessitate phenomena. So that might be one route we could go down here. Okay, a final response to the explanationist, final objection, can be drawn from some ideas that are given in Mizrahi's article, An Argument for External World Skepticism from the Appearance-Reality Distinction. Mizrahi is not concerned with the explanationist response, but I think his argument connects to it in a fairly natural way. So essentially, this fourth objection is that inference to the best explanation is simply the wrong tool to use, because the skeptical challenge does not actually involve appealing to any competing explanatory hypotheses. So to respond by using inference to the best explanation just misses the mark. So why would this be? Well, so far we have presented skeptical arguments in terms of skeptical hypotheses. We have the common sense hypothesis versus various skeptical hypotheses, such as the brain in a vat hypothesis, and then the claim is that that our experiences do not decide between these two hypotheses. So recall how I put the skeptical argument, right? If I don't know I'm not a brain in a vat, I don't know I have hands. I don't know I'm not a brain in a vat, so I don't know I have hands. Now, the question is, what exactly is the justification for the second premise, for this premise that I don't know I'm not a brain in a vat? Well, it's simply that if I were a brain in a vat, everything would appear the same as it would if the common sense hypothesis were true. If I were a brain in a vat, it would still appear to me as if I did have hands. The appearances do not decide between the common sense hypothesis and the brain in a vat hypothesis. But with this point in mind, we can give a more sort of general argument for skepticism. So we can say, I know that P, so I know that I have hands, or I know that I'm not a brain in a vat. I know that P only if I can distinguish between it being the case that P and it merely appearing that P. But I cannot distinguish between it being the case that P and it merely appearing that P, so I don't know that P. The appeal to the brain in the vat hypothesis, and indeed to other skeptical hypotheses, that works as an argument for skepticism only if this argument works. Because this is what underlies premise 2 of the skeptical argument, the claim that I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat. But if this argument works, then we've already established skepticism, right? Like we already get the skeptical conclusion. So what's really fueling external world skepticism, as Mizrahi sees it, is simply the notion that knowledge of reality requires us to be able to distinguish appearance and reality. If it being the case that P and it merely appearing to be the case that P, if those are indistinguishable, then you cannot know that P. Skeptical hypotheses make this problem vivid, but they are not essential to the problem. We can just straightforwardly appeal to this distinction between appearance and reality. The key point is, I can't distinguish between P and the appearance as if P merely on the basis of how things appear. And I mean, there are standard examples of this, right? So the stick in water appears broken. When we remove it from the glass, we see that it's not really broken. Maybe I put my hand in some water and it seems that the water is warm, but it's not warm, it only appears warm because I had my hand in a bucket of ice before placing it into cool water. If I consider simply the appearances in these cases, I have no way of telling that the appearance is not veridical. So that is if I just look at the appearance of the stick, nothing in that appearance tells me that the experience is not veridical. Rather, I know that it's not veridical on the basis of further experiences. I can reach out and touch the stick, or I can pull it out the water, or maybe I might just appeal to past experiences of seeing sticks in water or whatever. This is what justifies me in thinking that the stick is not actually broken. But of course, the appearance-reality distinction applies not just to specific experiences, but to all experience. And that's where we get the skeptical problem. So, like, how do I tell whether P is mere appearance or whether P is really the case? Well, in general, to distinguish between the appearance of P and whether P is really the case, I must be able to examine P independently of the appearance of P. I can do that in the case of the stick in water, because I can pull the stick out of the water, or I can reach into the water, and so on. I can examine it under other conditions. In this way, I have other means of accessing the stick. In the case of specific experiences, then, we can use other experiences as means of independent access. But obviously, I can't do that for experience in general. There's like no way to, examine the external world itself independently of the appearances as if there is an external world. Our access to the world is always mediated by appearances. Now notice that this is not to say that access to the world is always mediated by, perceptual objects like sense data or whatever. We don't need to postulate any items like that. We can actually just endorse, direct realism, because even direct realists will allow that there is an appearance-reality distinction, and that even if I'm directly perceiving, say, a tree, I can't, from appearances alone, distinguish it being the case that there is a tree from it merely appearing that there is a tree. So this is, at least as Mizrahi sees it, this is what the skeptical argument really rests on. Now, the inference to the best explanation response works by trying to show that we are justified in denying skeptical hypotheses. The common sense hypothesis provides a better explanation than the alternative skeptical hypotheses. So I do know, for instance, that I'm not a brain in a vat. But Mizrahi suggests that the argument for skepticism, it rests on the appearance-reality distinction, and that doesn't invoke skeptical hypotheses in itself. Skeptical hypotheses are perhaps tools that we can use to illustrate the skeptic's point, but it's not what the argument really rests on. So it might be suggested then that the question of which hypothesis is the best explanation is simply irrelevant, right? Like if you're kind of responding to skepticism by like trying to weigh up the explanatory virtues of the common sense hypothesis versus various skeptical hypotheses, you're missing the point, because the skeptical hypotheses aren't actually what's important. So this might be perhaps another possible response to explanationism, that it misses the point. Okay, well that's all. That's all for today, at least. So thanks for watching. Hope you found it interesting. Goodbye.